Hello students, I am going to tell you about the Forest Rights Act, which is a macro policy initiative of the Government of India and indeed a landmark legislation because it recognizes for the first time that something must be done for the development of the tribals, an issue much neglected even in independent India. You know that the Constitution of India testifies to the welfare commitment of the Indian state. But as Bordone notes, in many parts of India, the poor have started questioning with slowly growing assertiveness what has been one of history's most well-entrenched and ornately elaborate ideological systems of legitimizing inequality and exploitation. So this exploitation and inequality that was spawned by the British has got aggravated even in independent India, necessitating this landmark legislation. The questioning becomes more acute with the expansion of the market nexus. Even in situations where the state is apt to neglect its welfare commitment, such turmoil from below and messy politics in an open and burgeoning polity like India can go a long way in prodding the state to live up to its welfare commitment. The case of the emergence of the Forest Rights Act bears testimony to this, and therein lies its significance. The Scheduled Tribes and other traditional forest dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, simply referred to as the Forest Rights Act or the FRA, enacted by the Indian Parliament in 2006, however, did not emerge from unproblematic and consensual deliberations. Rather, the struggle to pass the Act and to keep the key elements intact was fraught with intense contestations. Central to the process of policy development in this case has been the use of collective pressure through an unusual coalition of interests spread across the states of India, which ultimately paved the road to this new institutional settlement. The case of the FRA throws light on the importance of protest or campaign politics in India and the simultaneous importance of activists to form effective coalitions involving individuals and groups in order to influence the course of legislation. While the preponderance of politics in matters of economic decision-making gets highlighted in this politics of the FRA, the process underlying the legislation reveals the multi-actor and multi-layered, of course, given the federal structure of India, the nature of the Indian state, and the significant role of interstate politics in promoting or thwarting pro-poor institutions. And for all these reasons, the FRA becomes an extremely significant piece of legislation in independent India. What was the context? The question of the poverty-stricken tribals, particularly the issue of their vulnerability, even after so many decades of India's independence, cannot be ignored. The process of pro-poor welfare legislation as embodied by the Act reveals the engagement of a multiplicity of key actors, each trying to negotiate at the highest levels of decision-making in a bid to steer the legislation in its favor, or even with some segments to sabotage it altogether. And that is why I have referred at the very outset to the intense contestations that underline the FRA. The nature of the negotiation process and the contestations through which the Act was finally given shape reveals the fragmented character of the Indian state. We must also consider at the very outset the reason behind this legislation, and that is definitely a lot to do with the vulnerability of the tribals and the forest dwellers. The history of tribes and other forest dwellers inhabiting this part of the continent is a history of exploitation and extortion that has continued for ages, assuming particular intensity during the British, who virtually indulged in a rape of India. During the post-independence period, the scheduled tribes were provided with certain constitutional safeguards, including reservation in government jobs and separate administrative structures wherever possible. For instance, under the 6th schedule of the Constitution, the entire state has a different set of governance provisions, provided that state is inhabited predominantly by scheduled tribes. The 5th schedule is applicable at the district level and provides for administration and control of scheduled areas, and gives powers to the governors to make regulations for peace and good governance of the scheduled areas inhabited by the scheduled tribes. We have also read extravagantly about the deprivation of tribals down the ages. The deprivation of the tribals and the problem of non-recognition of their rights to land and forest resources worsened after independence, when the unsurveyed community lands under the princely states, the zamindars and private owners, were transferred to the forest department through blanket notifications declaring them deemed reserved or protected forests. The march of independent India in the direction of industrialization and progress also brought about new threats for the tribals and the forest dwellers, who became pawns ready to be sacrificed at the altar of development and modernization. Ramnath observes that there are numerous cases where the usurpation of tribal lands is overlooked by a largely non-tribal government that accepts tribal people's displacement as a condition for development. Indeed, the interests of the tribals have been bypassed. After independence, an influential conservation lobby ensured that the colonial legacy of a regimented forest service was vested with the task of protecting India's biological diversity. In the 1970s, the Indian Parliament began to take an active interest in formulating policies and regulations to protect India's environment. Serious concern over the decline of the tiger necessitated that protection was resumed with renewed vigor. In 1976, provisions were inserted into the Constitution that imposed responsibilities on both the state and the citizens to protect the environment. And in all this, the haplessness of the tribals have got aggravated. There ensued a spate of notifications of national parks and sanctuaries seeking to protect and preserve India's wildlife and their habitat. The Department of Environment was established in India in 1980 for the purpose of ensuring a clean and a healthy environment for the country, and this was subsequently upgraded to become the Ministry of Environment and Forests in 1985. Consequently, the traditional users of land, who are referred to as the Adivasis, were being increasingly restricted in their access to what had sustained them for centuries. These people were increasingly looked upon, ironically, as encroachers. The poverty of the tribal renders the tribal vulnerable. The Ministry of Environment of Forests is today the primary agency in the administrative structure of the government for planning, promotion, coordination, and overseeing the implementation of environment and forestry programs. The ministry works towards conservation and survey of flora, fauna, forests and wildlife, prevention and control of pollution, afforestation and regeneration of degraded areas, and protection of environment in the framework of legislation. But then do remember that the state is not a unitary actor. As Leftwich clarifies, politics can be conceptualized as consisting of all the activities of cooperation, conflict and negotiation involved in decisions about the use, production and distribution of resources, whether these activities are formal or informal, private or public, or a mixture of all. Thus, every legislation, every policy carries behind it a larger story about the contestations and lobbying carried out by various actors, both governmental and non-governmental, including the influence exercised by something as amorphous as public opinion. It is therefore important not to conceive of the state as any kind of neutral administrative agency, nor simply in terms of its capacity for public governance. On the contrary, the state is a set of interrelated institutions and organizations shaped and driven by political forces and processes. So, what is the policy process underlying the legislation of the FRA? The policy process reveals the nature of the state as a multi-actor and a multi-layered entity, and the primacy of intrastate politics in matters of reaching decisions on pro-poor institutional reform. From the standpoints of the key actors, two main opposition positions emerged. One group who were supportive of the legislation and another group which opposed it. And you will see this very interesting tussle has animated the politics behind the FRA. So, what about the arguments on part of those who were canvassing in favor of the tribal rights? The collective campaign by forest rights activists, various political parties, champions of human rights harped on the following arguments in favor of the Act. First, the issue of democratic rights on part of the people who have been long deprived, the tribals. Group demands articulate over the years and often manifesting in the form of agitation politics and social movements could no longer be ignored by the central and the state governments. Second, it has been felt that the insecurity of tenure and the fear of eviction are perhaps the biggest reasons why tribal communities feel emotionally as well as physically alienated from forests and forest lands. The Act is therefore welcomed as a means of poverty alleviation of the tribals. Third, as far as improved incentive to ensure conservation is concerned, it is perhaps erroneous to assume that conservation of the natural resources of the country will be possible through a strengthening of the colonial practice of forest governance. One cannot afford to ignore any longer the tremendous traditional knowledge and practices of several tribal communities and forest dwellers which were conservation oriented. So, this Act will actually ensure that state forests gradually give way to people's forests, with tribals taking care of their own lands. But there were various arguments also put forward against the legislation. First, it was widely feared that India's forest cover is dwindling. With such legislation, the situation could worsen. The underlying fear is that conferring occupational rights on the tribals will result in large-scale felling of trees. They will do whatever they want. Second, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries cannot be constituted in areas with traditional rights where the Gram Sabha is expected to be the governing authority. Third, conservatist fundamentalists in particular remain worried by the legislation because they feel it would sound the death knell for the tiger population and even the biodiversity of the country. So this right might stand in the way of conservation of the tiger population, which is a top priority. Fourth, it was felt that such legislation would result in irrational distribution of forest lands to tribal families and communities. Within the village, social tensions may arise if certain communities are not granted the status of a scheduled tribe. Fifth, the Act provides for the ceiling of occupation of forest lands for purpose of recognition of forest rights to the area under actual occupation and in no case exceeding an area of 4 hectares. But this will be practically impossible to monitor in case of communities which practice shifting or jhum cultivation. But despite these attempts to sabotage the passage of the Act on part of the anti-legislation activists, the FRA did see the light of day, and that is no mean achievement on part of the Government of India. A significant feature of the revised bill and subsequently the Act, which resulted from the incorporation of a joint parliamentary committee recommendation, was an expansion of the beneficiaries of the Act to include other traditional forest dwellers alongside the Adivasis or the scheduled tribes. This was heavily opposed by wildlife conservationists who apprehended that non-tribal persons who have occupied forest land may take advantage of this vague definition to claim rights under the Act as other traditional forest dwellers. But despite protracted opposition, the Forest Rights Act was ultimately legislated by the Indian Parliament in 2006. Some of the salient provisions of the Forest Rights Act deserve attention. The Act recognizes and vests forest rights and occupation in forest land in forest-dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers who have been residing in such forests for generations, but whose rights have never been recorded. Second, the Act provides for recognition of forest rights of other traditional forest dwellers, provided they have for at least 3 generations prior to 13 December 205 primarily resided in and have depended on the forest land for bona fide livelihood benefits and needs. A generation for this purpose would mean a period of 25 years. Third, the cutoff date for the recognition and vesting of forest rights under the Act will be 13 December 2005. And fourth, the Act provides for the ceiling of occupation of forest land for purpose of recognition of forest rights to the area under actual occupation and in no case exceeding an area of 4 hectares. The Act provides for conferring rights in the national parks and sanctuaries, also renamed as critical wildlife habitat, on a regular basis. The Act provides for the right to hold and live in the forest land under individual and common occupation, for habitation or for self-cultivation, for livelihood by members of a forest-dwelling scheduled tribe or other traditional forest dwellers. And the Act also recognizes the right of ownership, access to collect, use and dispose of minor forest produce which has been traditionally collected within or outside village boundaries. However, there are grounds for apprehension even when the Act came into force. First, the Act seeks to recognize the rights of those residing in and who depended on forest or forest lands for bona fide livelihood needs. It is not clear what residing implies. Most forest dwellers do not strictly dwell inside forests but live on the fringes and are dependent on forest land for their survival and livelihood. It is also disturbing that neither the Act nor the rules specifies time limits for the work to be done by the various committees in recording and accepting claims, which means that people can be kept waiting for any length of time. Third, the Act is commendable in as much as forcible displacement of the people has been made illegal. The Act also specifies that in case of illegal eviction or displacement, there will be in situ rehabilitation, including provision of alternative land. However, the rules fail to clarify as to who will provide this alternative land. Fourth, implementation of the critical wildlife habitat provisions is likely to be highly problematic. So in the end, one wonders whether this is really a populist gesture on part of the government, or is it a case of political triumph in favor of the neglected Adivasis. One wonders whether the FRA is at heart a populist gesture on part of the government. On the one hand, there are some who believe that it is basically a political move to cover up its failure on the development front and shift focus to its commitment to democracy and human rights. This is important in an age of globalization when India, along with its pursuit of higher economic growth, must also display, both nationally and internationally, its concern for and commitment to the plight of the poor and the marginalized segments of the population. But in all fairness, one has to admit that the FRA is commendable and a rare case of politically marginalized groups like the forest-dwelling tribals and the forest-dependent poor extracting a concession from India's ruling political elite. It could well be an indication that the politicized poor are becoming increasingly influential, that they are becoming more capable in terms of defending and extending their autonomous spaces within India's political economy. So it is definitely a feather on the cap of India's democracy also. Their economic security or pauperization in the days to come will depend in good measure upon their ability to safeguard and protect both their private and common property on which their livelihood depends. So what is the real significance of this legislation? One has witnessed in independent India a spate of new social movements which are important in terms of the void they fill, where the state and other social and cultural institutions are unable or unwilling to act in the interest of their members. Social movements step in where institutions do not exist, or when they fail to serve or violate and contradict people's interests. These new social movements today mobilize people in pursuit of common interests. One may thus view in the legislation of the Forest Rights Act an indication of the maturing of Indian democracy from a centralized, elitist, even statist domain to a decentralized, participatory and a mass-based plane where the common people are definitely having a voice in the future of the nation. Does therefore the Forest Rights Act represent the state's welfare role? Dispensing its welfare role through pro-poor institutional reform, the state may well resemble some kind of scaffolding of which the FRA is just a plank. However fruitful it will be, or to what extent it will deliver its promises, will depend on how well integrated it is with other mechanisms and devices addressing the same cause. In that sense, the FRA must be read together with legislations like the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996 or PESA and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005 or NREGA PESA, essential in extension of the constitution for tribals and forest dwellers, guaranteeing that in Schedule 5 areas, the Gram Sabha will have the power to manage community resources and must be consulted on land acquisition, resettlement, etc. But then we understand that the FRA is necessary but not sufficient. Indeed, the contents of the FRA hold vital implications for the lives of the tribals and the forest dwellers of India. At the same time, it must be accepted that the Act by itself will not alleviate the poverty or improve the plight of the marginalized forest-dwelling people of India. It is certainly a landmark legislation that needs to be complemented by other informal institutions. Such informal institutions may make the formal institutions more effective or efficient and may fill gaps. One recognizes the need for complementary institutional mechanisms and interventions for making the FRA both operative and fruitful. So there is clearly need for complementary legislation, and this is highlighted by the case of the FRA. First, government clearance will not be enough for starting industrial and developmental projects in the forest. It will be mandatory to get the approval of the tribals who live in these forests. Second, a major difficulty in implementing the Act could well be the lack of awareness among the local people about their legitimate rights, claims, and entitlements. This aspect is crucial for processing claims. Third, a major hindrance on the path of effective implementation of the FRA is the dismal state of land records. There is lack of accurate and reliable information about actual forest cover. So there is definitely need for orientation. Alongside the measures that I have just enumerated, one must also remember that the FRA as an institutional intervention entails a change in the rules of the game. Don't forget, the forest bureaucracy has so long held a domineering position in matters related to land and forests in India. Under the FRA, clearly such domination of the Forest Department stands challenged, and this calls for reorientation, perhaps some kind of an attitudinal change on part of the forest bureaucracy. And finally, the need for better coordination mechanisms have also to be put in place between the central and the state governments, and the experience among states with regard to the implementation of the Act have been quite diverse and disparate. So what has worked well in one state has not necessarily been replicated or echoed by another. And this diversity across Indian states needs to be kept in consideration. There is definitely need, therefore, for better coordination between the centre and the states. The case of the FRA clearly suggests that in the absence of proper and sustained coordination between the centre and the states, the difficulties involved in the task of implementing such legislations will considerably increase. The FRA is no doubt pregnant with many promises for the scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers of India. But then it is easy to proclaim people's rights on paper. Corresponding institutional changes will have to be initiated to make the promises on part of the FRA a reality for those for whom it has been designed. So the FRA is definitely a necessary intervention. A study on the poverty among tribals in the southwest Madhya Pradesh reveals that despite significant changes in socio-economic and infrastructural development of the tribals pertaining to literacy, mortality, crops and markets, various anti-poverty programs, etc., nothing much has really happened, and there have been injustices which have not really got corrected. The study concluded that the ultimate solution would in restructuring the macro policies pertaining to property rights and access to resources, sectoral priorities, and social mobilization for bringing about substantial improvement in the people's livelihood. So the FRA is definitely a macro policy initiative, and therein lies its appeal. It is definitely a worthy initiative on part of the UPA government. It seems that it would be premature to dismiss the FRA merely as a populist gesture on part of the government. And even if it is, the contents of the FRA hold vital implications for the lives of the tribals and the forest dwellers of India. At the same time, it must be accepted that the Act by itself will not alleviate poverty or improve the plight of the marginalized forest-dwelling people of India. In conclusion, one has to therefore remember that if politics dominates the arena of policy making, it will be no less dominant in the domain of policy implementation. As in the case of the process which led to its enactment, effective implementation of the Forest Rights Act will also require intelligent activism geared towards building focused and effective coalitions both in the centre and across the states. This suggests that the state will need to initiate additional complementary institutional changes so as to curb attempts that are likely to frustrate the successful implementation of welfare measures for substantial sections of the Indian population as embodied in the Forest Rights Act, which, as I have reiterated at the outset, is a landmark legislation in India to benefit the poor and the marginalized. Thank you.